Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very happy to welcome you all, along with my colleague Ranaisa. I don't know if she's here, from English. My name is Hala Aouji. I'm an assistant professor in Islamic art history in the Department of Fine Arts and Art History. And together with the English department, we worked on bringing Dr. Annika Lenson here as a URB visiting scholar. It's really funny, I mean, Annika and I have been working on bringing her here for over a year, but I think this is attempt number 2. Attempt number 1, I believe the forces of nature conspired against us a couple years ago when there was that volcanic eruption in Iceland, grounded all flights, and so she was supposed to come here about 2 or 3 years ago. But I think the stars aligned in a better way this time around. She's here now during the time when she's launching her book that she co-edited with Nada Shabut and Sarah Rogers, that's coming out with MoMA. And it's called Modern Art in the Arab World, Primary Documents. And so it's a perfect time for her to be here, actually. Dr. Lenson is an assistant professor of modern global art at UC Berkeley. She has held many prestigious fellowships. The most recent one is the postdoctoral fellowship at the Beirut Research Institute in Los Angeles. She has her PhD from MIT in the history and theory of art. She also won the Margaret Savchenko Essay Prize that the Historians of Islamic Art Association give out to the best essay, the best student essay. And that essay was published subsequently in the Islamic art journal called Muqaddas, the biggest journal in that particular field. She has many other publications. She has articles in After All, Art Margins, Bidun, Representations in Other Venues. She's currently working on her monograph, and I believe today's talk comes as one chapter from that particular book. The book is tentatively entitled Beautiful Agitation, Modern Painting in Syria and the Arab East. The talk today is entitled False Gods and Demonic Promises, Fateh al-Mudarris's Critical Surrealism. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. For the invitation, I suspect this is not on. Thank you so much for this invitation and for coming to hear my talk tonight. I do apologize for the split screen effect, but probably the artist that I'm going to be talking about would have welcomed that, given that I recently discovered that in 1950, for the first Syrian art salon, this artist actually invented an alter ego and submitted all of his surrealist work under that other name. So if you're only seeing one side, it will actually support the analysis that I'm going to be developing and presenting to you this evening in this talk entitled False Gods and Demonic Attachments, Fateh al-Mudarris's Critical Surrealism. So I'll just get started. Fateh al-Mudarris is one of Syria's best known modernist painters. Born in 1922, he lived a life across many of the tectonic plates of the 20th century: war, occupation and imposed nation states, the violent displacement of refugees, social and labor movements, anti-imperialist struggles. Of course, the list goes on. He is still remembered today in film documentaries, surveys of the region's artists, auction sales, and now also major survey exhibitions of global post-war practice, including a recent exhibition at Haus der Kunst in Munich. When he was alive, he seems to have been capable of introducing the possibility of free action via contrarian thought into even the most grindingly official of Syrian state events, to turn premises on their heads, releasing the participants from their obligation to normative behavior and speech. But whereas a number of valuable studies have articulated the influence of his personality on friends and students, and some also attention has been devoted to his iconographic subjects, such as children, peasant mothers, and Syrian landscapes, very little analysis has been devoted to the critical aspect of his mobilization of those same subjects in his painterly methods in ink and his actual application of paint onto the surface. And in particular, what I view as their strongly negative critical relationship to the triumphalist nationalist pieties that were in place in Syria when he was working. Certainly, the artist's own statements in the 1960s articulate a cutting doubt about the status of humanity in the history of organized human life. So this idea that organized human life is actually counter-humanity. In August 1963, Al-Mudarris put together a solo show for Gallery 1 here in Beirut, where he exhibited paintings of groupings of people, or rather, groupings privileging their faces and hands that are arrayed in tightly compressed space, so that they look to be embalmed in archaeological strata. The work's titles reference civilizations and their sites: Sumer, Tadmor, Ras Shamra, and an idea of a honeymoon, which we can talk about later. And these help to support an archaeological reading. Curiously, though, the artist's exhibition statement characterizes the visual effect of this sudden stoppage of movement as a testimony to his own optimism. He states, and we just had a whole wonderful session on translation, so I feel very self-conscious. So this is a highly provisional translation that we can certainly talk about, and it's a difficult passage anyway. These paintings represent the optimistic side of myself. For in them you can see how much I love man. I stand at the canvas beside him, sharing in the waves of indictment, both fated and fabricated. Obeisance without end, worship without end, and the imputation of guilt without end. Just as I put the spectator in the position of the accursed, too, for he is helpless in front of these faces cast out of lead, love, and silence. This is a completely counterintuitive description of optimism, based on an idea of accursedness, and the statement seems to have posed an interpretive challenge to artists. Syrian critic Hassan Kamel, writing for El Ma'arifa only a few months after the Ba'ath Party coup of March 8, 1963, locates optimism in the artist's use of human figures and his professed interest in peasant life. And he praises El-Mudarris for resisting the allure of abstraction. Ilyas Awad, an artist briefly affiliated with the Shar group in Beirut, drew a different explanation from the mythic Tammuz story that had also inspired his poet colleagues. And he writes that these paintings remind us that sunlight in spring will always return to offer salvation from barrenness, even barrenness wrought by current war, sickness, and chaos. My own initial reading of that passage wanted it to be a proposal of political commitment akin to Walter Benjamin's 1934 call to authors to act beside the proletariat by joining them in the real proximity of a shared struggle, rather than simply depicting struggle. Recently, I've come to revise that view, and that's what I'm exploring with you tonight. I still take this description of optimism to be a political statement concerned with the dynamics of solidarity, but I'd like to position El-Mudarris's principle of optimistic interrelations not in struggle per se, but rather in his sense of the abject status shared by humanity, a status of worship and guilt. And that's the dynamic I meant to invoke with my title phrase, demonic attachments. The problems of personal and political formation that are at present the subject of cultural criticism engaged with attachment theory. I think that those dynamics are of concern to El-Mudarris as well. And that is the kinds of love that are and were thought to emerge out of an infant's need for a caregiver, such that a child continues to seek comfort and protection from even an insensitive or cruel familiar caregiver. So recently, critical theorists such as Lauren Berlant have looked again at attachment as a scene through which children can organize an optimism for living, and emphasize how attachment can also offer terms for continuity and even solidarity in the fact of our enthrallment to our families or to one another as adults, or to cultural and political forms. Berlant's work is situated in a present defined by a neoliberal demand for affective flexibility. Those are not the conditions that obtain in the Syrian 1960s, of course. Instead, it would seem to be a quality of enforced optimism in the Arab world when national armies assisted national development in the name of national pride, that El-Mudarris may have seen as a threat, seen attachment and even this kind of optimism as a threat to meaningful human flourishing. He saw a risk of a cruel dynamics of attachment where desire got turned into talismans and ended up propping up false gods. The stakes of that threat in a setting such as Syria are extensive. As he and his colleagues well knew, the material heritage of the ancient civilizations of Greater Syria bespeak a human history of idols and blood sacrifice, a most dramatic history of harmful overattachment to appease vengeful god parents. And that's where my adjective demonic comes in. It's meant to invoke both Cartesian deceiving demons, but also the notion that the ancient polytheistic world was populated by idols and false gods. So demons as spirits that possess persons and animals. The point is that for Mudaris, it was of great concern that the ancient artist in Syria had served to further an anti-humanist cult by producing sculptures later understood to harbor gods and spirits. So rather than creating art for itself or its presence, create art that then gets inhabited by this idea of powers greater than the own creator of that work. So to better substantiate these claims, let me expand some time exploring two key elements in my equation on El-Mudaris's critical practice. The first is surrealism and its formations in Aleppo. The second is the position of heritage objects in the lives and careers of El-Mudaris's independence generation. I'll then conclude by analyzing this optimism, or returning to the question of optimism and how we can find it or recognize it in some of the artist's mature drawings and paintings. So importantly for my interest in practice, when El-Mudaris stages a confrontation with false gods, he often makes use of surrealist techniques of automatic composition. Consider this drawing from 1952. Our artist is not yet 30 years old. He's working as an English teacher in Aleppo's preparatory high school, and at night he's going to the city's cafes and cabarets. There are many wonderful, colorful tales of that activity. He was also a frequent visitor to the literary salon of poet Orhan Maysar, where the question of the possibility of automatic surrealist painting and its testament to the human condition was an active concern. In this case, Mudaris is not necessarily seeking to offer a proof of concept. Instead, this is a cafe game meant to amuse friends. So it would have been made almost like a performance with friends gathered around. A Rorschach-style inkblot sketch. Its folded composition ensures a bilateral symmetry no matter how free and automatic the distribution of the ink. And this gives the resulting blot a deceptively rational appearance. That's the magic of the Rorschach. You seek meaning from what seems to be rational but is not. El-Mudaris's work as artist comes after the fact. You can see that he draws two pen shapes in the place of tensile poles that suspend the blot over a dreamscape plaza as if it were a piece of flayed meat. He then adds other miniature objects that heighten the psychological quality of the suspended appearance. You can see a small memento mori-like grouping of skull and flower in the foreground, wraiths that cast long shadows on the ground, and on the far horizon, strange architectures that have been erected there haphazardly. None of these items interact with the blot so much as they demonstrate its alterity to them. The blot is a visual presence, not a representation, in a projective space left to exist as is, rather than be made to become something else. And yet it still exists as a threatening presence. Maybe you see a flayed animal, a possessive spirit, or a sacrificial body. Now let's consider a second inkblot drawing from the same period. This time a black shape of opaque ink with an opening at its center. El-Mudaris has again added annotations of detail. There's a schematic Bedouin context that appears with the outline of a carpet, a landscape with a caravan, and perhaps some sort of elaborate crown or veil on the figure in the center. There's a hint of divining practice as well, something like letter magic in the carpet, a hint at the word Allah that never coalesces as a word. Once again, these annotations don't seem to touch the inkblot. Its density overtakes everything else, suggesting even a reading of sacrifice, a blood-like stain that overruns the body and clings to it. We see a gaping maw appear, and the figure becomes simultaneously feminine, like a vagina dentata, or masculine, wearing a beard. As a total thread of man and woman, it becomes godlike. As such, the drawing might be understood as a votive structure. When it's used by a supplicant, and you can see actually the fold on it, evidence of physical grasping, it brings the viewer into confrontation with a figure of bearded judgment. At the same time, however, the ink shows its destructive properties to us. As in the drawing, it gathers as a surface of blackness to produce a face. At the very same time, it seems to cover and blind the face. Which surrealism are these drawings making use of? There are any number of genealogies for surrealist practice in the Arab world. Beginning in the 1930s, mentions of the movement are frequently to be found in the cultural press. Sometimes the name stands in for modernity and up-to-dateness, as in a brief report in the Damascus journal Al-Thaqafa, which I found in 1933. Elsewhere, surrealism marks a radical challenge to a bourgeois art world. Most famously, there is Cairo's Art and Liberty Group of 1938, recently receiving quite a lot of press because of an excellent exhibition at the Pompidou. That group was a loose collective of intellectuals, artists, and avant-gardes in Cairo and Alexandria who allied themselves to the international anti-fascist cause. And in 1939, they published a number of unillustrated debates about art in El Risala. And as a side note, this is fascinating to me that almost all coverage of art ran without any images at all, just the discursive shapes that came out of the sort of invitation to think about art. Further, many a modern artist has claimed a practice of divination as a magical analog of artistic practice. We can think of the mystical strands of primitivism and the radical decontextualizing image practices of what's been called the ethnographic surrealists in 1930s Paris. Men who studied fieldwork techniques from intellectuals like Marcel Mauss, and then traveled to the flea markets and to far-flung ports in the world in search of the sacred alive in the present. This history actually extends directly to Syria under the French mandate. The French Institute in Damascus provided a site of training for Sorbonne-educated ethnographers, and this includes Syrians who were trained in ethnography and Frenchmen who were trained in ethnography in the 1930s in Paris. And the Frenchmen used their colonial posts to conduct studies of rural populations and cultic practices, and they actually gathered objects that they sent back to the Trocadero. The photograph I show you here was taken in Deir ez-Zor area and then filed in the French Museum. And it's called Play in the database, but it of course is also offering documentation of a collective appeal to divine presence. And this is precisely the kind of practice that is attracting our Francophone surrealists across that whole continuum, both Frenchmen like Michel Leiris and Georges Hénain in Cairo. None of these French-affiliated practices seem to be direct entry points for Al-Mudaris. I'm sure it was in the ether and facilitated an engagement in surrealism, but they are not what he mentions when discussing his turn to surrealism. His first exposure came around 1943 when he was attending boarding school in LA. So nearby here, trying to get into AUB presumably, and studying everything in English and reading the latest journals there. He accessed its ideas in English books and journals, and he really emphasizes this. And that makes his touchstone Herbert Reed. He was paying attention to what has now been characterized as a second wave anarchist version of surrealism that emerged in 1936 and included a wide cast of characters, which we can talk about if there are surrealist specialists in the audience. Al-Mudaris characterized that time at boarding school as a refuge from the unrest of the war years. But very importantly, the English surrealists themselves were absolutely subject to the unrest of those war years. Their group was scattering, either by escape or by entering into military service, and members went to Egypt, where they met back up with the surrealists there, and others, English servicemen who subscribed to the movement during their active duty, writing in to request membership so as to survive the collectivism demanded by the military structure, were shipped to the so-called Near Eastern Front, bringing their sketchbooks and publications. This proved most foundational for Baghdad's experience of surrealism, although Aleppo too hosted some English-speaking surrealist critics that are mentioned never by name, but always the fact that they were English-speaking and offering to take ideas back to the New World. This is a sketchbook by a British soldier sent to Baghdad to protect the oil and transportation routes, making surrealist imagery of this experience, and mixing with ambitious Iraqi students such as Jamil Hamoudi and Naim Katan in the cafes and in the clubs. Hamoudi and Katan launch a number of journals devoted to modernist ideas. There's one here on the left that's a handwritten copy with a hand-drawn copy of a Picasso sketch meant to alert their colleagues to the existence of this kind of art. And on the right, the journal Al-Fikr al-Hadith, famous for championing surrealism as a modernist topic. Contributors to that journal included Simon Watson Taylor, a leader in the English surrealist movement who had arrived in Baghdad in 1946. His communications, which were translated into Arabic, provide news and updates about surrealists working elsewhere, in Romania and Belgium, and plans for a Paris exhibition in May 1947. I'm harping on this not because Baghdad and Aleppo were in constant contact, but rather just to establish the robustness of the print culture that was circulating these ideas in the 1940s. It was a networked and diasporic world surrealism of the wartime, and that quality was completely captured in this proliferation of updates on surrealist practice and surrealist initiatives. For the most part, the experiment in surrealist composition that unfolds in Aleppo unfolds via efforts to compose poetry. It's a very literary effort to start with. It flourished under Orhan Mayasar, already mentioned, and Ali El Nasser, a medical doctor by day, who also wrote symbolist modernist verse. Mayasar hosted a salon-style gathering at night. This was attended by many famous poets. If people are fans of Syrian poetry, Omar Abu Risha, a very young Adonis, Khalid Said, and El Mudaris goes there as well, writing poetry and working on new kinds of painting. Many of these figures were previously working with symbolist tropes of interiority and its submerged knowledges of sex and hauntings. And their surrealist churn was a conscious effort to achieve an aesthetic of condensation. So they were seeking brevity and also density. And I know this is super small, but I'll just quickly point out, this is in the translated volume that was just launched, and it's explaining that in 1937, Ali El Nasser was writing a poem of 76 words, and that's the long verse on the top. And by 1947, he'd condensed it down to 16 words, reading a lip, mortal remains from a lacerated flower, disfigured with nothing left of its harmony, but a drop of blood staring at an eye. And Mayasar gives us a beautiful description. He says the group had come to believe that an eye brimming with tears is much less splendid than an eye whose tears are burning away, which is a really lovely idea if you think about saline and salt of condensation. Mayasar began to speak and publish on his view of surrealism, and again, these texts mention international figures in passing, but those figures are not hailed as exemplars. Instead, he speaks about how a true surrealist practice requires complete and unadulterated automatism in writing or drawing. That means nothing is supposed to get in the way or mediate the kind of free and direct expression of what had otherwise been suppressed. And he rejects even the use of symbolist visual language as a trifling para-surrealism. I'll just show you a picture of Ali El Nasser to give us a sense of our Aleppo cosmopolitans working together in the 1940s. Literary critics, Selma Khadra Jayusi is one of the few who has analytically thought about this particular theorization of surrealism and how it is distinct from other platforms. As she notes, Mayasar follows other surrealists in calling for the, how do you say it?
Yes, sir.
When I met with Hayyan Darkal in Damascus, she always said Mayasar.
No, yes, sir.
Okay, Mayasar. But it's not with an aleph. It's not with an aleph.
ميسر. No, ميسر شدك.
So why was she saying it like that? All right. This is casting her knowledge down. No, I know, like Adnan. The brother who also painted, exactly. Well, my apologies, I'll try. So Mayasar soon began to speak and publish on his programmatic view of surrealism. And again, this is talking about a need for complete and unadulterated automatism. Sorry, I already read that part. So Jayusi explains that he's following other surrealists in calling for the liberation of the unconscious. And the structure of the unconscious, for our critic, is a large reservoir collecting the reactions of our own clashes with our physical surroundings. The Arabic term that is used in the critical writing rather than the cover of this book describes surrealism as the school of what lies behind reality. So, wara. As such, we can oppose it to the beyond reality connoted by the French surrealism. What the Aleppo surrealists are interested in is a register of life behind the world that is produced in part by psychological operations. And they're interested in the unformed perceptions that this throws up, challenging artists to try to capture them. It is also a particular idea of ontology, of a being that exists within a yawning totality that predates and outlasts any figure or subject within it. This was described sometimes as the totality as a single large self, an ego that exists behind all things, and sometimes in language that merged biology with religion. In 1947, it was written that this is where the, quote, creative God and the created embryo merge to compose a single entity, a single view, a single feeling, and a single life that stretches across millions of years, end quote. These convictions prompted the group to de-emphasize the novelty of surrealism. Instead, they argued that it, like all other art, issues from a human compulsion to create in the face of uncertainty, and indeed to create not as expression, but rather as protection of the self. Now I'm so self-conscious. Mayasar suggests that with nothing to grasp onto and nothing but ash blowing between our feet and the distant horizons, man feels it necessary to claim life by saying something. This speech takes the form of art, or of text, or of music. He suggests that the ancient artist erects a colossal work of stone carving to mount resistance to the void, as does a contemporary poet in the creation of verse. The risk of such creation is the risk of human attachment. Over the history of time, artists and their peoples tend to become so attached to the protective presence that they imbue it with a cruel, godlike authority. The promise of surrealism, then, for these artists is that it might convey unseen powers in a new way that would not be objectifying, that would actually combat the problems of objectifying these feelings and fears. At the conclusion of his essay, Mayasar describes surrealism as a true scream. It manages to connect both terror and its response. As such, it pursues catharsis and also achieves condensation. No images, just a desire to achieve this with not a very clear sense of how form will work in the service of that desire. And in fact, so these sets of ideas, I believe, inform Mudaris's sense that visual art can offer a site of confrontation with those large and otherwise invisible powers. Unfortunately, almost none of his visual work from the 1940s seems to be extant. It's reported that at this time, Mudaris was experimenting with using wax in his work, but I haven't found any of those. I found some of those from the 1950s, Saleh has some, but nothing from the 1940s. All I've got is this one painting preserved in very poor photographic reproduction titled Dancer of the Age. It would seem to be a dream image of an uncanny revenant. Our titular dancer appears as a set of reanimated bones arranged in a densely jointed circular pattern. This was received with rapturous enthusiasm when it was exhibited in Damascus in 1947. A visiting Egyptian symbolist critic wrote about it in Al Adib And our artist also showed it to his friends at the Café Brazil in Aleppo. One poet recalled how Mudaris came to them with a painting of what looked like a mortal coil with no head and no tail. Some onlookers saw an eye, and interestingly, others saw a radio dial. But I think the visual equivalent of this scream, this idea of catharsis and also condensation, really comes for Mudaris in this technique of the bleed. The use of pigment as a creeping force within a surface and through a surface. And motivated by that model of art as an index of human need that had been mooted in Aleppo, he increasingly counted himself as one of those others, summoned to behold the paintings that he himself had made as a sign of a shared fate. Okay, part 2, heritage. The embrace of modern psychology's map of the unconscious, its structuring around the accessible and inaccessible psychosexual experience, has frequently elicited new artistic readings of the objects of archaeology and heritage, with the latter being recognized as sedimented projections of human needs. So famously in New York in the 1940s, the psychological valences of surrealism are performed in a set of Jungian returns to wolves and to ideas of beasts in the past. And in the case of Mark Rothko, even to an idea of Syrian antiquity. This painting's from 1943, and it's titled Syrian Bull. Of course, one real distinction for El-Mudaris's generation of Syrian intellectuals is that the past could seem to be very near, and very near as a set of things. Objects within a shared event horizon sustained not only by the optimism of anti-colonial movements, but also the proximity of actual archaeological excavation. The objects recuperated from these sites told tales of cyclical civilizational movements against which ideas of triumph or independence seemed foolish and even impossible. Thousands of tablets unearthed from Ugarit at Ras Shamra near Aleppo, for example, relayed epics of gods and sacrificial rebirth. At Ur, meanwhile, the grisly discovery of death pits gave the impression that the occasion of royal weddings had precipitated celebratory human sacrifice. I'm going very quickly, I know, but that idea of the wedding, I think, links to the thematic of the honeymoon that Mudaris was working with in the 1960s. It's not a joyful honeymoon. It's a premonition of a terrible end that will then lead to civilizational rebirth. And did anybody go to Ryan Tobit's exhibition yet? When you go, you'll see also a meditation on these sort of artifacts, the 1930s history that was incorporated and enfolded into personal histories via this investment of foreign governments in these excavations in Syria. At the high point of excavation activity in 1935, there were 17 active digs with a wide variety of European sponsors. And then interestingly, and I think importantly, in the early days of Syrian independence, these foreign archaeologists made a triumphant return to reopen the sites that they had had to close during the Second World War. And when they did that as partners with the Syrian Ministry of Antiquities. So we have a Frenchman, André, I'll say his name wrong too, my French is even worse, Parot, I'll just say Parot. How do I say it? Parot. Okay, thank you. Parot, who between 1933 and 38 presided over the excavation of those thousands of tablets at Mari, the ancient Euphrates city on what's now the Syria-Iraq border. He returned in 1951 as a collaborator of Salim Adel Abdul Haq, the Sorbonne-trained Syrian scholar who is now heading the Antiquities Department. Oh, I was supposed to leave that up there, but I think this is a wonderful image. We can recognize the traces of these archaeological escapades in Mudaris's work in a variety of ways. Simply, the visual status of the objects could be powerfully estranging. And when Parot published his annual proceedings and notes, he circulated images of fragments recuperated from the site that verge upon surrealist effect on their own. Consider this series of eyes in situ photographs from an autumn 1937 campaign. Or consider, this is not Parot anymore, this later approach to illustration, a color image of a helmet found at Ur belonging to a warrior named Meskalam Dug, printed by Leonard Woolley in 1946. So this is a advanced color printing technique in the 40s. The book mentions that this helmet is found alongside a crushed skull. But here the helmet's shimmering opalescence suggests some sort of pristine or alien existence. The helmet itself registers a missing body. It sprouts a delicate, fully modeled human ear, as if in tragic compensation for the loss of the person that's supposed to bear that helmet. And one of Mudaris's recurring sort of crutches when he's doing this surrealist imagery is to draw in ear-like appendages, orifice structures sprouting from the head composed of concentric rings. So to help you try to see that, I put those little boxes around them. Every time there's a kind of ink wash sketch, the artist goes back in and sort of draws these circles that always in the place where an ear might be if there had been an actual body. To think of these growths in Mudaris's drawing as analogs of heritage forms is to again contemplate this potentially shared, even universal dynamic of investment and loss at the personal level of psychoanalysis and at this civilizational level of organized cultic practice. Cultural criticism in this era of the 1940s devotes attention to the past as a resource, but also a liability in the struggle for self-creation. One striking account comes from historian Albert Hourani, who in 1944 wrote a commissioned essay for the British journal Horizon that offered Syria as a destination. His essay invokes Syria's mythic landscape, writing that every yard of Syrian ground carries a sense of not just the past, but indeed a drama of incarnation. Incarnation defined as eternity breaking in upon time. Whether bodied as Christ or as Adonis, the blood of the latter still recognized as the agent that turns the river Ibrahim red year after year. This is all Hourani's writing in 1944, reminding British tourists if they ever come to Syria what they should perceive when they walk on its soil. These are cyclical readings of sacred time that Perrault mobilizes as well. In the 50s, he cast his work at Mari in a universalizing guise in tune with the UNESCO initiatives of the period. So before, in the 30s, we had a lot of text explaining the finds. In the 1950s, we get a photo book titled simply Mari that has very little text and instead proceeds as a sequence of full bleed, saturated black and white images that offer readers intimate views of monuments and fragmented bodies and faces as an invitation not only to comparison, but also empathy, right? You're supposed to look at these and see yourself or a version of yourself, or to see humanity with a face. In a single-page introduction to this book, our archaeologist puts the point on the stakes of recognizing close familiarity with Mari. He calls the site a world unto itself, both familiar and foreign. At Mari, there are countless, quote, countless civilizations emerging from the soil and arising from the grave, end quote. And their remnants give testament to the continuity of human genius. Perrault goes on to say this is not art for art's sake, it's art in the service of religion. So he's really using the Syrian counterpoint to intervene in the 1950s debates about formalism or about functionalism. And he also says that at the palaces, they find overwhelming evidence of tremendous patronage of art objects by these kings and sovereigns, but that all of that investment in statues and paintings fail to protect those sovereigns when the next civilizational invasion comes in. Okay, so then this heritage is not proper protection. This is the kind of activated concern, both exciting and terrifying in the 1940s. Can we define heritage in another way where it might exert a counterforce, exist in cosmic energy rather than against it? This is the question that the intellectuals of the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party raised in the 1940s. While pursuing a new brand of ideological political agitation, they also generated a highly influential aesthetic theory about creative Syrian personality that was based on Antun Saadeh's reading of the Antiquity of Greater Syria. I have to mention this because although El-Mudaris never joined the party, all of the other figures I've been mentioning are cited as having, in the 40s, been briefly affiliated with this cultural program. They were then drawing on revelations at Ugarit to make a case for an artist-driven renewal of the present. Artists could be beacons of society. They could again enact this creative potential that made the Syrian personality the site of all civilizations. So this Fertile Crescent myth that is maybe discredited in the archaeological register is of supreme, exciting importance to these artists, thinking about how they personally fit into these nested pathways of affiliation. So as I said, I think it's really important to recognize that these parties are actants in Syrian modern art. They're actually sites of theory in the 1940s at least. So that Mayasar, Adonis, El-Khal, Khalda, Said are all mentioned as members who then leave under extreme duress and, of course, abandon the party, but in the 40s are thinking with it. And the SSNP's cultural journalism in the early 1950s offered views of the possible resonances of art, past and present. This is an article by a critic, Aida Esmar. I don't know anything about her. I would love it if anybody else knows something. Writing for the SSNP newspaper El Jil El Jadid, and assessing the offerings of the National Exhibition in Syria's exhibition hall in 1951 on the criteria of spontaneity, creativity, and originality. She actually loved this work. The Porter by Edhem Ismail, I've written a lot about it in other contexts, and she read its use of an arabesque line and color as a proper index of Syrian vitality. In doing so, she drew an affinity with ancient Syrian arts. She talked about Syrian arts as guided not by a concern for mimesis, but rather a desire to uncover latent meaning behind shape or form. By this reading, an arabesque line is a process of condensation akin to ancient Syrian statues of kings and lions. I'm again summarizing what she argues. That these statues are seeking to consolidate the characteristics of all kings and all lions as types of presence. Therefore, she sees the arabesque not as an Arab form, but rather a Syrian one that identifies a Syrian animating light as the enabling source of subsequent Arab cultural signs. I'll be happy to talk about the fascinating tensions between a model of Arab culture and Syrian culture, which is truly very activated in this period. And I'll also just say that Adonis also wrote art criticism in the 1950s for the newspaper El Bina. And to promote the book that just was launched, we did translate one of the earliest pieces that we found by him, which he wanted to reject as juvenilia, but we convinced him, and that's in the volume translated into English. So what are the stakes for this for an art historian? I want to emphasize how singular in a way it is that Syrian artists found themselves in conditions where they could claim the option of a horizon of resurrection that the whole world associated with Mesopotamia and the Holy Land, right? So this is the 1940s. We have artists elsewhere spending the war years trying to outrun the destruction of life and landscape. We're going to get 13 months after Horani's writing, the world sees the global catastrophe of Hiroshima. And Syrian artists see all of that, feel all of that, and have recourse intellectually to thinking through that cycle as a kind of sacrifice that had long been understood mythologically to give rise to new life, to flora, fauna, and new habits and modes of love and adoration and salvation. There is a much better known literary analog to this, which I've been dancing around, and that's, of course, the Tammuz Ii Poetry affiliated with the journal Shar of the late 50s and the early 1960s, which Adonis and Yusuf El-Khal are presiding over. And that's the group of poets whose verses invoke Syrian figures of resurrection, such as Tammuz, Orpheus, the Phoenix, and Christ, to probe the genealogies of self and culture as an anarchic multiplicity. That project's drawn a lot of attention for its capacity to secularize the idea of myth. Talal Asad has written about how the iteration of the same mythic figure multiplies it and therefore precludes the possibility that any sacred authority could remain in place. I find that analysis helpful for understanding Mudaris's work. This is a set of the ink drawings that he actually made for Shar. He was briefly involved in the journal's life in 1963 and 1964. But whereas the literary treatment of myth is highly dematerialized, our artist was deeply concerned with objects and objectified presence as products of an expansive Syrian history, dense with folded time. Looking out at the past and the future, he saw objects made by creative humans becoming, time and again, not just alienated from their makers, but elevated and accorded godlike powers. The result, again, to emphasize it as he himself spoke about it, was told by these antiquity objects left behind, a dehumanizing legacy of people building monuments, telling stories to themselves, only to later surrender their own agency and experience ruin. So the final section, section 3. Let me return then to the painting, the mature painting of our artist Al-Mudaris, and propose some readings or more complicated readings of some of his famous works. In 1960, a reporter asked our artist whether he believed that art was a national mission. That's at the height of the UAR. The question of a national mission is something artists have to answer to. But in the reply, Al-Mudaris sidestepped the premise that art could carry a specific patriotic mission, explaining that he saw art as a realm within the spiritual activity of a community, and that art made it possible to imagine the nation in the first place. For him, art could not be compartmentalized, but rather was a piece in a storehouse of energies and love, such that true art consisted of, quote, creation without fabrication, end quote. As I said, I take this testimony in a way to be tactically duplicitous. What are you going to say during the height of the UAR when in your own imagination, the place of art's creation is an expansive Syria rather than an organized Arab unity against the world? But I also take it to be true testimony to the artist's preoccupations. He is painting falah figures, children, religious charms, and maternal goddesses. He is thinking about art's relationship to something like a national collective. And yet, importantly, the sacrificial altar, the kind of purpose of ancient art, is never far from any of these new images of life that he is making. In this painting I'm showing you here, consider the imminent threat of ritualized death that we find here in something he calls Child and the Wall. Notice that the surface is a plaster-like impasto ground. It's very thick. It plays with precluding the idea of pigment soaking into the surface. It has to sit on top. And you get drawings of children, flowers, and tiny trees, all contained within a schematic house shape. Each element is pretty separate and distinct, and this invites a sequential reading. We notice next, I notice next, when I look at it, a rust-red handprint on the wall above the head of the child. This resembles ancient handprints found in the Lascaux caves, a sign in Eurocentric art historical narratives of the time of a universal propensity to make art in man's own image. But of course, it's also a sign in Arab Muslim ritual practice of blessing, the ceremonial, the handprint placed after the ceremonial slaughter of a sheep. Above it, the artist introduces a second sign, a phrase in blue pigment that seems to say Masha'Allah, but upon closer inspection appears to be altered by the insertion of a kaf and a noon, so that maybe it says Masha Ka'annallah, or the thing willed as if God. With this change, we get a reminder that the artist's sovereign act of drawing has brought these representations into being. They've been willed as if by God. And further questions of agency arise. Do we see then an image of divine intention or a sham image where the artist is simulating, the latter being willed only as if by God? The longer one inspects the markings on the wall, the more they seem to foreshadow violence or suffering. Of course, that question of what will happen to the makers of images, but also this smear of red that sits there on top of the horizon line, a passage of white scumbling that engulfs the child's legs, the barrenness of the ground beneath the pitched roof. In the same period, Elmidaris continued to use surrealist sketch practices always as performances meant to amuse and astonish and unsettle his friends. He made a series of monoprints in a gallery that he was involved in. These would seem to thematize a Freudian version of attachment, lack and supplement. One print depicts a union between male and female bodies, or maybe a cowering mother and crying child. The artist's addition of floating passages of stippling play, I think, with gender inversions. When the stippling passes over the face of the captive figures, they create an impression of stubble that masculinizes the woman and adds premature age to the baby. And he does this in other, I'm not just inventing it from one. He does this in many. This is my example that I want us to look at here. Notice also that the artist deploys the same symbol from the horizon line of his 1952 inkblot sketch. All right, we get our phallic long oval blanked by two circles, this time working more clearly as a paternal threat. Hanging in the foreground in our motto print, it's a supplemental object that terrifies the cowering figures. To read this back into the archaeological imagery of the 1950s is to recognize that the judgment of the father can be a fatal one, in which adolescent fears of castration are transposed into civilizational fears of the wrath of a deity. Finally, Elmidaris began also to make the matter of surface a problem of his artistic concern. I showed already the impasto treatment of Child and the Wall. And around 1962, he began to prepare his canvases by mixing sand right onto the surface. I think he did it earlier, but this is the first time he exhibited it at one of the national exhibitions. So it's the first time that Syria's own critics remark upon it. By this choice of technique, of course, he takes a painting that was exhibited in '62 under the title Family in the Open Air, and negates the idea of open air, making this a material suspension. The yellow line has a further suffocating effect, sealing the family below in its act of picnicking. Not unlike the mode of painting used in Child and the Wall, these layers of material establish a base upon which Mudaris manipulates his repertoire of parts of bodies. If he intends to use these figures to depict a reproductive unit, a family, they are highly over-articulated. All women have breasts, marking them as adults. Is this a harem image? Is it some strange window into time where future maturation is also captured? Notice further how attention to the condition of fructification is captured in the repetition of those circular parts. We get a pile of round fruits on the table. We have round trees in the landscape behind. And then, of course, the one character out of place in this image of fructification is the central one. We've come to see him as Christ, so much so that this painting has the alternate title, The Last Supper. He bears an X instead of an O. If viewed as a protagonist of a mythical story cycle, this marks him as that accursed figure, or perhaps an anti-hero. If we read it in psychosexual terms, it suggests an absent phallus. If the figure is taken to be Christ, the X may suggest both virginal conception and condemnation to death. In each case, these sites of encoded birth and death would seem to hold a messianic power to redeem, to shift the logic of waking life. And the other point I wanted to make about this painting, and this is also something we see in Mudaris's work of this time on sand, the color red is used completely irrespective of the figural markings, as if the surface is just manifesting a sign of blood. And the red patches can become blushing cheeks, maybe embarrassment, again, maybe violence. And the painting seems to sort of bring that presence into the surface and swallow it back up by virtue of this decision about medium. Who sees optimism in this? Our artist does. So to how and why, I mean, the provisional answer, and this is actually something I remain actively engaged in as I work on this chapter, which will go into the book, and as I present it to audiences that, of course, are called to witness and cower before different experiences of the piece, but to recognize the misuse of creative energies, the way that creative energies get rendered into overlords, is perhaps to stage the possibility of emancipation. This is a painting that is not quite an object. Of course it is, but it has a surface that swallows its own pigment. It becomes activated. It doesn't hold its shape in the way that antiquity does. I think the artist is interested in that. And it then poses the question, at which register can we effect the correction? Can we reorganize our optimism? Can we claim freedom? Do we do it first in art, or do we have to do it first in our social groupings? I'm not sure the artist had an answer. I think he was calling us with these paintings to that question. And his surrealist images show the question to be necessary and also irresolvable. In the ink paintings that we saw, the inside actually permeates the outside and vice versa. The same is the case here. For the artist, the response to this condition of mutual implication, we are all called to witness this, was increasingly obvious, if also increasingly difficult, because of the normative systems of authority taking place in his country. The answer was to topple all gods, open all borders, and release all bodies. Thank you.
So we have time for questions.
Yes.
To answer your question about the optimism, maybe it is because it shows, his paintings show that people are very sturdy and they can bear all the suffering, and this is where the optimism comes. Does this make sense?
It makes perfect sense, and I suspect if asked, the artist would testify to that. What's interesting is that his imagery shows the most vulnerable, the most permeated, the sort of least sovereign bodies, right? So that I'm really interested in that contradiction. I think, yes, there's an invocation of survival, but the question is at what time scale the survival seems to happen. Is it a singular individual, or is it this terrifying but promising civilizational scale that dwarfs the human being? And I think because the 1960s were a time of such great contestation about who was going to lead the campaign to organize civilization and heritage and collectivity, I feel that the artist is a little ambivalent about who gets to nominate themselves to outlast the pressures. So I completely agree, and I think the artist is a humanist. I think he's interested in the body's capacity to withstand, but I think he's also worried about it. Yeah. Well, okay, so yes, that is a frequent, did everybody hear the question? Of course, the biography of the artist is a crucial piece of information often invoked to explain the imagery. He, as a child, his father was murdered, and his mother was a Kurdish peasant, and that cast doubt onto their whole matrimonial union. They were cast out of the family home in Aleppo, and he was invited to return only later by the notable Mudaris clan. And then he himself, yes, I understand, his first two children had some sort of disability and died young. I don't think that that's a sufficient explanation for a variety of reasons. Of course, biography isn't. But I also, this is why I made so much of these two ink blots. They predate his children. And they cue up so many of these thematics, which one can then see them as the first stage, and the subsequent tragedies obviously amplifying these concerns about punishment and the scale of punishment. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for this wonderful imagery and wonderful interpretation of it. I have a question on tradition and the work that he does and how he reinterprets it in his work. Because he's what you're saying is he's at a time when the archaeological digs were producing or showing and displaying more and more work that is obviously extremely sturdy, to use the term, whereas he's publishing very ephemeral work on sketchbooks and with sand. It's as if he expects all these works to die eventually and not make it to the next archaeological dig 3,000 years later. So, but he does, what you were saying, if I understood you correctly, that he was using art to claim a civilizational role and a political role within the nation state. How does he talk about this at all, or how does he relate to these times?
It's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer. He talks about heritage all the time. He's always asked about Torah. He's always asked about the nation, but I don't have great, the archive is really interesting because what do I draw on to try to ventriloquize the artist? We have published newspaper interviews in a hyper-controlled press where you can only answer in certain ways, and if you don't, the transcript will still appear as if you answered in a certain way. And then there are letters that his son let me look at that are sent back and forth, but none that kind of contain a sort of I think this. So it's, he talks often about the greatness of Syria, of the capacity of the Syrian personality to continue to create. He does seem to see that as an argument for the kind of privileged status of the region, if not the Syrian nation state. And I think most artists in this generation actually, kind of an argument I'm trying to make in the longer book, is the way in which affiliation to a national collective can actually be contesting state power. So we usually think of art as a component in nation building. But in Syria, the national imagery often actually seems to be refusing to buttress the state. And I think this is a dynamic that is, of course, utterly lost in the official accounts that are published in Syria. It's sort of what I want to insist on, going by the evidence of these more private communications and their sketches. So that doesn't quite answer, that hedges, because that's my question also. And it is very difficult to feel confident recuperating what he thought. So instead, that's the other reason I use drawings so frequently. At least in the drawings, these weren't made with the expectation they're appearing at the National Gallery. They had smaller, more fragile and differentiated audiences that could see them and speak about them and be called to react to them in these other settings. So I let my imagination run away with that stuff. I used one of the articles you shared with me. Yep.
Thank you for the lecture, as always. I have two questions. You presented a constellation of references that you are proposing he was kind of relying on. And I noticed that most of your images were either taken by phone or camera. So the first question is this constellation the result of you looking at his and other Syrian artists' archive? Is that where we're kind of making these connections and relying on the kind of the veracity and the credibility of such connections? The second question is more about really methodology. I'm just wondering what surrealism does for us here in analyzing Al-Mudarris's work. Because we might as well talk about Fauvism or Dadaism and other movements that you could certainly detect in the type of work that he was producing. I mean, I would certainly, for Iraq, I would actually contest surrealism. I have enough evidence that Baghdadi artists were not interacting with it. They were actually rejecting it as a form of kind of decadence.
How can you say that? We have this printed journal.
That's a one-off, and we have to remember that Fiqh al-Hadith is really not the only one, not the only publication at this time. And again, a British artist does not really represent Baghdadi artists. But again, that's kind of like a Baghdad argument, so I'm not kind of imposing it on Syria. But again, like I'm just wondering, especially given the lag and the kind of the lateness of what these artists were doing in the mid-20th century, what does this sort of connection to surrealism do for us? I mean, would you not rather look at what other artists in the region and around the world were producing at the time? Or, again, these brilliant connections to kind of archaeology and the kind of things that were emerging locally. And in a way, there's enough like surrealism, or at least like the connections between the mythical and the real, and these kind of objects that he might have been relying on. So, again, even though you did find evidence of discussions around surrealism, but you are the first person, I would imagine, who's proposing kind of a surrealist reading into Al-Mudarris's work.
I'm not. I mean, so great questions, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to express a disagreement and maybe even debate. The first question was about the veracity of using archival material. So you're right. Not everything I looked at will be looked at by others. I intend to get as much permission as I can to put it into a book. And the beauty of being an art historian is we make elaborate arguments around images, and the counter evidence is carried in the image itself. That's what's exciting, right? Like once it gets out there, hopefully there can be many other readings. I tend, however, I'm a pretty conservative scholar. I prefer printed materials because I can date them, and I can also imagine that the arguments in printed materials were stable enough to warrant a small circulation. So that allows for slight extrapolation beyond an individual career. And and also presumably there might be multiple copies of such testimony that others had also accessed. So it's a good question, and we talked about it at the launch. Nobody feels comfortable sitting on stuff they alone can look at. It's the worst. It's the worst position to be in. But of course, individuals need to feel comfortable sharing it. So one just asks and hopes that that's appropriate. The question of the term surrealism. There are a number of critiques, and yes, anytime a person uses the term for a movement that is highly recognizable, has a set of leaders, André Breton, known for deciding who gets to be in and out and booting people out of the group, it's a certain risk, and the question is, what does that bring to the discussion? One easy response, or the kind of immediate response, is Mudarris used this term. His literary circle used this term. In fact, in the newspapers of the 1950s in El Adib, so extending here to Beirut, there is an elaborate, extended debate, Jamil Hamoudi is involved in it, over whether works are symbolist or surrealist. So there was a clear, if not always agreed upon, sense that there was a threshold that a person could rise to in order to be counted as a surrealist. And it was actually important enough that people would publish things saying, so-and-so says it's surrealist, but it's merely symbolist. So there's a certain stake for these players in that term. The reason I spent so much time tracking the fugitive instances of the promotion of surrealism in Baghdad isn't to suggest that there's an Iraqi surrealism. I'm pretty sure I didn't say that. In Baghdad, there's a collection of individuals who, from a variety of backgrounds, are able to say and wish to say, I'm sharing this surrealist platform with you, and are you also a surrealist? And they were exhibiting in Cairo and thinking about that. I also am not certain that I would call surrealism belated. It's, and that's why I was trying to talk about the psyche so much. What's powerful about a model of the psyche is that it's universal, super individual, a structure shared by a structure of significations shared by everyone. And in a way, or the appeal of psychological surrealism is you can escape this problem of belatedness. Anybody can try to access what's been suppressed. And the final thing I'll say, and again, I mean, these are all highly active debates, and these are the positions I'm taking on them, is that the war displaced the first version of surrealism and transformed it. Breton became a dull figure nobody liked, who was trying to raise money in New York and nobody cared about. And the English surrealists were clearly of great importance to the men that were conscripted into service. And there are all of these letters in the Getty archive between men on the front to the arbiters, talking about meeting with Georges Hinaine, talking about arriving in Baghdad, talking about people being interested there. So there's this, in that scattering, I do think a kind of reinvention which allows, or kind of furthers this idea that to become surrealist is to avoid belatedness or to shift the terms of that debate. And I think that was actually of tremendous appeal in this period.
Yes, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. My question is about embedding this question of surrealism in its local debate that was going on specifically in Chad around that time. And Adonis, we know for a fact that Adonis was making all sorts of links to surrealism and
Exactly.
Sufism.
That's right. Yeah.
So my question to you, do you think there's a branch that kind of branches out from this, if you want to call it this direct traveling tradition that's coming from Europe, but that was later embedded in a much, in a horizontal, but also kind of a historical lineage that kind of predates and wants to declare itself as predating the European origin of surrealism. And I'm wondering if you see that connection in his work.
I love that question, and I do not know what to do with Adonis's writing about surrealism and Sufism. I mean, the volume that eventually comes out in the, when does it come out? In the 90s, right?
But it started as a small...
Of course, no, I know, exactly. Like the version that eventually comes out is so francophone in its coordinates, like who is supposedly surrealist and hyper-limited. But of course, the gesture to Sufism is expansive and deep and important. And then the argument, as best I understand, and it sounds like you know better than I, because I really do, in the end, throw up my hands and dislike the attempt, is it's fascinating analog, right? So he says, it's like this, Sufism's structured this way, and so is surrealism. It's also structured this way. And then the question actually is, what do we conclude from that, I guess? Do we conclude that the Sufists, ancient and modern, don't need surrealism? Do we conclude they're operating in the same space of what creation means? I'm not sure. I do find the Mayasar model, which Adonis cites as formative for him, and which Khalida Said also counts as formative. Therefore I find this 40s formation of particular interest and fascination, where Mayasar is not saying there is a Sufistic version that's an analog of surrealism. He's taking Sufistic concepts as a calque to better explain surrealism. And he seemingly doesn't feel the need to say there are these two separate named isms. Instead, he's sort of thinking about them together as this universal structure of things that are suppressed that can then be brought into visibility and can then be confronted and thought through. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm explaining my sidestepping and confessing why. Thank you.
Any
All.
other questions? That's it. No other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.